Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to get into something that you probably don't even realize you do all the time when you're trying to learn something new. I'm talking about analogies.
Analogies, yeah. When you try to relate an idea that's new to you to something you already understand, it
Exactly.
happens all the time.
And for this deep dive, we're going to unpack a really interesting paper by Kevin B. Zook, all the way back from 1991.
Yeah, it's called Effects of Analogical Processes on Learning and Misrepresentation.
Right.
And it's all about how analogies can be super helpful for you as a learner, but also how they can lead you astray sometimes if you're not paying close enough attention.
Yeah, you know those moments when you're learning something and it suddenly clicks?
Oh, yeah.
It just makes sense because it's like something you already know. Well, analogies are often behind those aha moments.
Yeah.
But they could also be behind those, moments of frustration where you're like, wait a minute, this analogy doesn't really work, or this analogy has actually led me to the wrong conclusion.
Yeah, exactly. And Zeus paper is so interesting because it helps us understand what's going on in our minds when we use analogies. It looks at two key ways that they come into play. First, when you as the learner are trying to make the connection yourself, you're searching for something familiar to link the new information to. And second, when somebody else, like a teacher or a textbook, presents you with an analogy to help explain something.
Right. So our goal today is to explore both of those scenarios and see how analogies can help us build those mental bridges between what we know and what we're trying to learn. But also to understand why those bridges can sometimes be a little wobbly, maybe even lead us in the wrong direction. By the end of this, you should have a much better sense of how to use analogies to your advantage and how to spot when they might be steering you wrong.
Yeah, I like that. Steering you wrong.
So let's unpack this idea of analogies as a fundamental learning tool. Why are they so powerful when we're trying to wrap our heads around something new?
Well, at a really basic level, learning is all about making connections in your mind. New information doesn't just exist in isolation. It becomes meaningful when you can tie it to what you already know. And analogies are great at creating those ties. They let you compare different areas of knowledge that might seem totally unrelated on the surface. And the key is that they focus on the underlying structure, the way things relate to each other, rather than just superficial similarities.
Right, so it's not about saying that, for instance, an atom looks like the solar system.
Right.
It's more about the way the different parts interact. Like the nucleus is in the center like the sun, and the electrons are orbiting around it like planets. It's the relationship that matters.
Yeah. Exactly. It's the relationship. And as Zook points out, these connections, they can happen in two main ways. You might generate an analogy yourself, like you draw on your own experiences and your understanding to make sense of a new concept. Or you might encounter an analogy that someone else has provided to help you understand something. And both of these ways can be really powerful, but how effective they are really comes down to your ability to identify those core structural similarities.
Right.
If you just focus on what looks similar on the surface, that's where things can get a little messy.
Okay, so we've established that analogies help us learn by connecting new ideas to existing knowledge through shared structure. But now, where does Zook's model fit in? How does it help us understand when these connections might actually lead to, well, misconnections in our understanding?
Yeah, I think Zook's model gives us a really helpful way to think about this whole potential for misunderstanding.
Yeah.
It suggests that whether an analogy helps or hinders you really depends on two things. One, where the analogy comes from. Is it something you came up with or was it given to you?
Right.
Two, what kind of thinking process is most involved? And Zook identifies two main processes here, selection and mapping.
Selection and mapping. Okay, so for you, the listener, selection would be about, choosing the right familiar thing to compare the new thing to.
Exactly. So if you're trying to understand something new, you're trying to come up with your own analogy. Your first step is to select like a base domain, something you already know well that you think has a structure that's relevant to the target domain, the new information you're trying to learn. Mapping, on the other hand, that's what you do after you've chosen your analogy. You take the different aspects, the relationships within that analogy, and you start applying them to the new concept.
Okay.
You're figuring out which parts of the familiar thing correspond to which parts of the new thing.
Got it. So the model looks at how the origin of the analogy, whether it's learner-generated or teacher-generated, interacts with the potential difficulties in either selecting the right analogy or mapping it correctly. And this interaction, according to Zook, is what determines how likely it is that we'll end up with a misconception.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really interesting way to think about it, this
Hmm.
interaction. And the model lays out four possible scenarios, or, quadrants, based on these two factors. So when you as a learner, you generate your own analogies and you struggle with selection, with choosing a good fit. The model says there's a high potential for you to misunderstand the new information. But if you generate an analogy and your main difficulty is with mapping, with applying it correctly, the potential for a misrepresentation is actually lower.
That's interesting. It seems kind of backwards at first. Why would picking the wrong analogy be a bigger issue for our understanding than messing up how we apply a potentially good one?
Well, think about it this way. If you start with a comparison that's just fundamentally flawed, it doesn't matter how carefully you try to apply it, you're not going to arrive at a correct understanding. The foundation's off, right?
Right.
However, if you've selected a decent analogy, even if you misapply some of its aspects, you're still working within a generally relevant framework, which might make it easier to correct those misapplications later on.
Okay, that makes sense. So what happens when the analogy is provided to us, the teacher-generated scenario that Zip talks about?
Right, so in that case, the selection's already been done for you. The teacher or the learning material has picked the analogy they think is best. And Zook's model suggests a low potential for difficulties with selection there simply because you didn't have to do the selecting yourself. However, the potential for difficulties with mapping becomes high.
Ah, I see. So now our main task is to figure out how the provided analogy actually connects to the new information. And if we map it incorrectly in our minds, we could easily end up with a flawed understanding.
Yeah, exactly.
So the model is really highlighting that the biggest risks for misunderstanding depend on whether we're the ones creating the analogy or the ones receiving it,
Right.
and whether the main challenge lies in picking the right comparison or using it accurately.
Exactly. It gives you a framework for anticipating where your learning might go wrong.
Right.
So now that we have that framework, let's delve a little deeper into each of these scenarios. Let's start with when you, as a learner, are trying to come up with your own analogies.
Okay, so when we're trying to generate our own analogies to understand something new, the first big hurdle is selection, as Zook points out. It's all about accessing the right prior knowledge, finding something we already know well that truly mirrors the underlying structure of what we're trying to learn. And it turns out this isn't always easy.
It's not easy at all.
Yeah.
And research on what's called spontaneous analogical transfer really highlights this. There was some classic work by Gick and Holyoke where they used this radiation problem.
Oh, yeah.
It showed that even when people had previously encountered a relevant analogy, say a military strategy for attacking a fort, they often failed to even notice that it could help them solve a seemingly unrelated problem, like how to destroy a tumor without damaging the surrounding tissue.
That's wild. You'd think that if you'd already encountered a similar problem and its solution, you'd be more likely to see the connection yourself. It's like the solution is right there in your mental filing cabinet, but you just can't find the right drawer.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's right there, but you can't access it. And Gick and Holyoke found that without a direct hint, only a tiny percentage of people spontaneously use that military analogy to solve the radiation problem.
Wow.
And this really points to the difficulty we have in selecting a relevant analogy just based on the surface features of the new problem.
Okay, so that's where the idea of what's called mediating abstract schemata comes in, right? This
Right.
idea that if we have a more general abstract understanding of the underlying pattern, it makes it easier to spot relevant analogies. It's like having a mental template for how certain types of things work.
Exactly. So if you have formed this abstract schema, a mental blueprint of the core relationships, then selection becomes less about noticing just surface similarities. It's more about recognizing that a new situation is just another instance of that same underlying pattern.
Right.
And Gick and Holyoke, their research suggested that encountering multiple similar examples can help us form these abstract schemata. So by seeing the same relational structure play out in different contexts, we start to recognize the common thread.
So, for example, if we see a few different convergence problems, like the military attack, the radiation treatment, maybe even a story about, directing multiple streams of water to put out a fire,
Right, exactly.
that could help us build a more abstract understanding of the multiple weak forces converging on a single point solution.
Exactly, exactly. You get it. However, even with multiple examples, as some other researchers, Spencer and Weisberg, they found that things like changes in context or even just a short time delay can make it much harder to select the right analogy later on. It seems like just having the abstract schema isn't always enough.
Really?
The retrieval process can still be tricky.
Wow, so it's like the context or the timing can actually act as a mental roadblock, preventing us from accessing that relevant knowledge even when we have it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then there's the whole issue of surface similarity versus structural similarity. And this is key to why we struggle with selection. Some other research by Holyoke and co., they found that spontaneous selection is much more likely when both the obvious surface level details and the deeper structural relationships are similar.
Okay.
But the danger is we can be easily fooled by surface similarities that don't reflect any real underlying connection.
Right, so like thinking two problems are the same just because they involve similar objects, even if the way those objects interact is totally different.
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of like, surface similarities are the attractive packaging,
Oh, I like that.
but structural similarity is the quality of the product inside.
Right. Yeah.
You always have to check what's beneath the surface before you rely on an analogy.
I love that. It's a great way to think about it. And Gentner, her work emphasizes this tendency to be drawn to these superficial similarities, especially when we're new to a topic. Like, it's easier to notice that two scenarios both involve a doctor or a weapon than to recognize the shared strategy of distributing force. And so if we base our analogy selection just on these surface features, we're likely to pick a base domain that doesn't have the right underlying structure, and that's going to lead to a flawed understanding.
So if you're listening and you're trying to, quickly grasp a new concept by finding a personal analogy, you really need to be mindful that that initial aha moment, that feeling of this is like that, might be based on something quite superficial, and it could ultimately lead to a misunderstanding down the line. You need to dig a little deeper and ask yourself, do these things relate in a truly fundamental way? Or am I just seeing a surface-level resemblance?
That is the key question.
I guess structural similarity is about the how and the why. Things work the same, even if the things themselves look totally different.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
You got it. It's about looking beyond the obvious, examining that underlying architecture.
Right. Okay, so let's switch gears now and consider the other side of Zook's model. What happens when the analogy is provided to us? What are the main challenges we face then?
Okay, so now you're in a situation where the teacher or the textbook has given you the analogy.
Right.
The selection has already been made for you.
Right.
And according to Zook, the main challenge now shifts to mapping, figuring out which parts of that familiar analogy are really relevant to the new concept and how they correspond.
Okay.
And Gentner's structure mapping theory is really insightful here. It emphasizes that good analogies, the ones that are helpful, they map entire systems of interconnected relationships, not just isolated features or superficial attributes.
Right.
So it's about seeing how the different components within the analogy relate to each other and then finding those similar relationships in the new concept.
So going back to that solar system atom analogy, it's not just about the sun being like the nucleus and the planets being like electrons. It's about the idea of a central body exerting a force that keeps other smaller bodies in orbit.
Yes, precisely. And that's a really, key system of relationships there.
Yeah.
And Gentner proposes this idea of the systematicity principle, which suggests that we're more likely to map a set of relationships if they're causally connected, if they're part of a coherent system. Isolated facts are less likely to be meaningfully transferred.
Right. Now, we touched on surface and structural similarity earlier in the context of selection. How do those play a role in mapping when the analogy is provided to us?
Well, structural similarity is like the backbone of a good analogy.
Oh.
It's crucial for a sound understanding. But those surface similarities, they can sometimes act as, like helpful entry points. There was some work by Ross on math problem solving that showed when the objects in an example problem were similar to the objects in a new problem you're trying to solve, it helped people access and use the relevant formulas, even if the underlying problem structure was the same across different examples.
Well, that's interesting. So the surface details can act as a kind of visual cue,
Yeah.
something that helps us get started with the mapping process.
Exactly.
Oh.
However, there's always a however.
Right.
The danger with teacher-provided analogies is what Zook calls overextension.
Overextension.
This is where you inappropriately apply aspects of the base analogy that don't actually fit the target concept. You're taking the analogy too literally.
Gotcha. Can you give us an example of how this overextension might happen?
Yeah, let's think about the analogy that's often used to explain mutualism.
Okay.
So, the relationship between ants and aphids being like that of farmers and cows.
Right.
They both benefit. Aphids get protection, ants get food, cows get shelter and food, farmers get milk. But if you overextend that analogy, you might assume that just as farmers sometimes slaughter cows for beef, ants might eventually kill and eat the aphids.
Right.
But that's not actually part of the mutualistic relationship. You're
Yeah.
bringing in that extra knowledge from the farming example, which leads you to an incorrect inference about the ants and aphids.
Right. So knowing too much about the base analogy can actually lead us astray when we try to map it to something new.
Hmm.
It's funny how our intuition can sometimes work against us with these things.
Yeah, it's true. And, it's not just about knowing too much about the base.
Right.
It's also about understanding the base domain well enough in the first place.
Oh, okay.
And Gentner, they did some work on electricity analogies, and they showed that if you use a hydraulic system as an analogy for electrical circuits, but you don't really understand how water flows through pipes, you're going to have a hard time making meaningful connections to how electricity behaves.
Right.
Similarly, there was a study by Hardiman and colleagues where they found that using a balance beam as an analogy for weighted means wasn't effective for students until they had a good grasp of how balance beams work.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not enough for the teacher to just provide the analogy.
Right.
It also depends on our existing understanding of that familiar concept that's being used as the base.
Right. If that foundation is shaky, the bridge to the new concept is not going to be very stable.
Exactly, exactly. So when you encounter these instructional analogies, in school or whatever, it's important to actively think about why certain aspects are being compared, what those underlying relationships are. Don't just passively accept the comparison, question it. Ask yourself, what are the key structural similarities here? Where might the analogy break down?
Right.
What are the features that don't overlap? Asking these questions can really help avoid those pitfalls of overextension.
Right. So it's about being an active participant in the analogy, not just a passive recipient of it.
Exactly, exactly.
Now, Kevin Zook's paper was published back in 1991, so I'm curious, what does it tell us about how our ability to use analogies develops over time?
Right.
Does our capacity for selection and mapping change as we get older?
Yeah, and the paper touches on this a bit. From a piageation perspective, proportional analogies, those ABCD relationships, they require formal operational thinking, which usually doesn't develop until adolescence.
Okay.
And this involves being able to reason about relationships between relationships.
So like a younger child might understand that a bird flies in the air and a fish swims in the water, but understanding the relationship between those two relationships, that both are examples of an animal moving in its natural environment, is a more abstract skill that develops later.
Yeah, that's a great example. And from an information processing standpoint, researchers like Sternberg, they've looked at the specific cognitive processes involved in solving these proportional analogies. And their work suggests that younger children often have difficulty with things like encoding the relevant features of the items, inferring the relationships between them, and especially with that mapping process,
Right.
understanding that higher order relationship between the two pairs.
Okay.
They also found that younger children tend to respond based on simple associations rather than true analogical reasoning.
So if you were to ask a young child, dog is to bark, as cat is to,
Right.
they might say meow, just because those are common associations, rather than thinking about the underlying relationship of animal making its characteristic sound.
Exactly.
But it's not all about limitations in young children. As Zook points out, research has also shown that even very young children have some analogical abilities, particularly when dealing with familiar contexts and obvious features. Jitner's work with spatial analogies showed that even 4-year-olds could map relationships between, say, parts of the human body and inanimate objects.
That's really interesting.
So a child might be able to understand that if a person has a knee in the middle of their leg, then if a mountain had a knee, it would also be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's a great example.
So the key here seems to be that young children tend to rely much more heavily on those surface similarities in their mapping. Gentner and Tupan, they did that Dole study, and Deloche, he did that work with miniature rooms.
Right.
Both of those showed that younger children are more successful at seeing the connection when the objects and the overall context look alike. And then as they get older, they become better at focusing on those underlying structural similarities, even when the surface details are quite different.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I guess the takeaway here is that while even young learners can benefit from analogies, especially when they're grounded in those familiar experiences, educators need to be extra cautious about potential difficulties with both selecting relevant prior knowledge and accurately mapping the relationships when they use these instructional analogies with younger children.
Absolutely. It's about being mindful of their developmental stage and the types of comparisons that are most likely to be meaningful and not misleading for them.
This has been a really insightful deep dive into the role of analogies in learning. So to bring it all together, what are the key takeaways that we should all remember?
I think the main thing is to remember that analogies are incredibly powerful tools for learning.
Yes.
They help us connect new information to what we already know, but their effectiveness isn't guaranteed. Whether you're trying to generate your own analogies or you're encountering them in your learning materials, you need to be aware of the potential pitfalls.
Right. And those pitfalls, as Zook's model highlights, depend on whether you're the one coming up with the analogy or if it's being provided to you. If you're generating it, the biggest challenge is often selecting a truly relevant analogy,
Yeah.
one that shares that underlying structure, not just surface similarities. If the analogy is provided, the main hurdle is accurately mapping the relationships from the familiar domain to the new one,
Exactly.
and avoiding the trap of overextending the analogy or misinterpreting it based on a weak understanding of the base domain.
Yeah, it's all about that careful selection and accurate mapping. And
Yeah,
being conscious of these processes, selection and mapping, can really enhance your learning.
absolutely.
By actively thinking about those structural similarities and the potential differences, you can make analogies a much more effective tool and avoid those frustrating moments when they lead you down the wrong path.
Absolutely. So as you go about your day, and you encounter new information or you find yourself trying to explain something to someone else, take a moment to think about the analogies at play. Are the connections being made based on real structural similarities, or are they just superficial resemblances?
That's a great point.
And if an analogy isn't quite clicking for you, consider whether the issue lies in the initial selection or in the way that the mapping is being done.
Right. Think about that selection and mapping. And here's a final thought for you to ponder. Think back to a time when an analogy either really helped you grasp a concept or perhaps led you to a slight misunderstanding. What were the surface similarities that caught your attention? And then what were those deeper underlying structures that were at play? Reflecting on your own experiences with analogies can really sharpen your analogical reasoning skills.
That's a great suggestion. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we highly recommend checking out Kevin Zook's original paper or, delving into some of the other research on those fascinating cognitive processes that are involved in learning. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.